Good morning, church family. This morning we are continuing our reading through the letters Paul wrote to several different churches. Today we pick up in Colossians, specifically Colossians chapter 2. In chapter 1, Paul greets the church of Colossae. He rejoices and expresses his thankfulness at hearing how the church was loving one another, how they were living in the gospel, how they were seeking it. And he was rejoicing in the fact that they had heard the gospel, rejoicing in the people that had brought it to him. And he was just declaring that he was praying over them in their growth as a church as they continued to seek after Christ. But Paul concludes chapter 1 and leads into chapter 2, which is the chapter we're going to be in, with a description of the character of Christ. He just declares and praises Jesus Christ for who he is, for the power that Jesus has in our lives, for what he has done on the cross. And he just continues to, in chapter 1, express the full magnitude of Jesus and what Jesus has done for us, and how Jesus frees us from our sins, frees us from being alienated from him, and brings us to being able to know God. Actually, in Colossians chapter 1, Paul writes in verses 13 through 14, "For he rescued us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption for forgiveness of sins." Paul is clearly trying to tell the church of Colossae the importance of who Jesus is. The importance that Jesus is the very core and foundation of salvation in the gospel. This gospel that they're believing in, if it is separated from the character of who Jesus is, Jesus as the Son of God, Jesus as a deity, then it loses its power and meaning. And this leads us into chapter 2. This leads us into the reason that Paul is writing this letter. And it's because of what the church of Colossae is facing. He writes to the church of Colossae, he informs them, he's like, hey, although I have not met you in person, I pray for you and want to minister to you. I want to teach you the gospel. I want to make sure, it's my heart's burden to make sure you seek God and seek his truth. And he addresses one of the things that they're facing. In chapter 2, he addresses the fact that the church of Colossae was facing false teachers that were teaching one very dangerous idea. And this was the idea that Jesus Christ did not have a true claim to deity, that he was not God. They were starting to decrease the value on the person of who Jesus was. They were saying that Jesus was just a man. Jesus was not as valuable as he is. And what Paul is trying to tell them is, by decreasing the weight of who Jesus Christ is, you are totally illegitimizing the entire gospel. Jesus is the core through which the gospel is played out. Paul is so heavily emphasizing the personhood of Jesus and how key and foundational Jesus is to the very concept of gospel and salvation. And he's saying the gospel and salvation you claim to believe in requires the deity of Jesus Christ, is built upon who Jesus is. So if your definition of who Jesus is faulty, then your definition of the gospel, your belief in the gospel is going to crumble. So salvation is carried out through the person of Christ and dependent on him being a perfect sacrifice. So any attacks on his deity is truly an attack on the legitimacy of the gospel itself. So that's why Paul in chapter 1 ends chapter 1 with this description of who Jesus is, the weight of Jesus' involvement in the gospel, what Jesus did for us. And then he leads us into addressing the problem facing the church of Colossae. In chapter 2, Paul writes in Colossians 2, verses 20 through 21, "If you have died with Christ to the elementary principles of the world, why, as if you were living in the world, do you submit yourselves to decrees such as do not handle, do not taste, do not touch?" So what we're seeing here is not only are they decreasing the personhood of Christ, not only are they thinking less of Jesus, and he's addressing that. He's saying, you need to see Jesus more. Naturally, if I'm decreasing something, I'm building something up. So what he's saying is, you're decreasing who Jesus is. You're decreasing his involvement in the gospel of salvation. You're decreasing how much you need Jesus in your life, and you're increasing your role. You're going back to rules and regulations. You're trying to achieve righteousness on your own. And what Paul is trying to let them see is, through the death of Jesus Christ, not only did I die to my sins, I also died to trying to be righteous in self. I died to sin. I died to self-dependence. I died to self-righteousness. I don't need to seek those things anymore. And he's saying you no longer have to cling to these rules and regulations to achieve righteousness. You can merely rest in the person of who Christ is. And if we get caught up in trying to achieve righteousness and trying to stick to regulations, then I'm going to completely miss the righteousness I'm trying to achieve. We must not miss that the attempts to reach righteousness in self are sinful and will always end in folly. Me trying to be self-righteous, me trying to take away from the hands of Jesus the work of salvation is foolish and will not end anywhere good. And that's something that it leaves us to reconcile is, am I in my life making too little of Jesus and too much of myself? Are there moments where I'm not soaking in the truth and magnitude of what Jesus has done for me? And am I missing the magnitude of who he is? And then in return, as I decrease his love, his grace, and the work that he did on the cross in the gospel, am I putting too much weight on my own shoulders to achieve righteousness? Am I putting too much dependence on myself? This isn't to say that I don't strive to live in righteousness and obedience, but that must be carried out through the person of Christ, not the person of myself. Thank you, church family. I hope you have a good day.